to tonight's public lecture by Dr. William Lane Craig, and it's entitled, Can We Be Good Without God? Exploring the Foundations of Morality. My name is Paul Chen, and I'm a professor in the Political Science Department here at Western Washington University. I'm also one of the members on the steering committee of the Western Christian Faculty Forum, and that is an affiliation of faculty, staff, and administrators that was established in 1999. The Western Christian Faculty Forum invites speakers who are experts in their field to interact with our faculty, our staff, our students, and members of our broader community, and to address topics of broad interest to those audiences. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge the financial contributions from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as the Cold Beverage Student Committee's Enhancement Fund, and for their help in bringing Dr. Craig to our campus. I'd also like to thank the various student clubs, churches, and community organizations who helped to publicize this event. Now, I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you actually visited the Facebook event page? Show of hands, okay. Wow. Well, we're glad it worked, and we're glad to see you here. Now, the other day, someone posted on the Facebook page a question, and they asked, is this event free? And I posted a reply. It might have been sounded a bit snarky at the time, but it wasn't meant to be offensive. And I said, well, no, this event isn't free. In fact, it cost quite a bit in terms of time and money and planning and organization. But for those of you in the audience, the intended beneficiaries of this event, it is free. The Western Christian Faculty Forum receives no funding whatsoever from the university, apart from special financial contributions that I mentioned before, which are given at the discretion of those units, and which any university group can apply for or request. Therefore, we rely almost entirely on the generosity of private donors, for which we are very grateful. If you'd like to give to the Western Christian Faculty Forum, and we certainly would welcome that, go to www.edu/give. After filling in the information on that page, you can designate your gift by writing in the space Western Christian Faculty Forum. There's also a button on the Facebook event webpage in the About section, and that will link you to the Western's online giving site. Your gifts are tax deductible, and 100% of your gift will go to help fund events like this. The reason is that the Western Christian Faculty Forum has no overhead costs, because those who serve on the steering committee give their time and energy to organize these events for free. But really, we really are very happy to be able to bring speakers like Dr. Craig to our campus, not only for the benefit of our students, but also for the benefit of members of our broader community. So again, we're glad that each one of you is here with us tonight to hear Dr. Craig and to participate in the Q&A to follow. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig is research professor of philosophy in the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in LaMirada, California. Actually, he is a double doctor. He has 2 earned doctorates, one PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England, and the other a doctorate in theology from the University of Munich in Germany. Dr. Craig has received numerous awards for, and has given over 24 invited lectures on, his work in the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of time. He has written or edited over 30 books, including the award-winning Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, written with J.P. Moreland, Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology, written with Quinton Smith, Assessing the New Testament Evidence for the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus, and his signature book, Reasonable Faith. He has also published over 100 articles for both academic and popular audiences. Now, if you'd like to see the titles of all these books and articles and lectureships, we encourage you to visit Dr. Craig's website at reasonablefaith.org. That's reasonablefaith, one word, no breaks.org. Tonight, Dr. Craig will address the question, can we be good without God? The issue of ethics and morality has come front and center in public debate, especially after the rash of public shootings, not only in the US, but around the globe. For in the US, us in the US, burned into our collective memory are such names as Columbine High, the Amish school shooting, Virginia Tech, And just last year, the movie theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, and most recently, Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut. Now, the solution to averting such tragedies is not necessarily more ethics and more morality, or gun control, or greater awareness of mental health illness, or better parenting, or just doing the right thing. But our understanding of the role of ethics and morality in our society definitely comprises one of the key components to answering a question that we all have asked: why? After his talk, Dr. Craig will take questions from the audience. Now, originally, I had offered to him to screen the questions using index cards, but he actually said he preferred taking the questions directly from the audience. So we will have a roving, one or two roving mics during his Q&A session, and I will, if you wish to ask him a question, I will recognize you. Please be sure, however, that it is a question that you wish to ask, and limit your question to one. So after Dr. Craig's talk, we will take a short break and then go into the Q&A. Again, just as a reminder, those of you in the overflow rooms in Artzen Hall 4 and SMATE 150 will have to come to Artzen 100 here to ask a question if you wish to do so. Tomorrow night, Dr. Craig will address the question, is faith in God reasonable? That will take place in the same room, this room, Artzen Hall 100, at the same time, 7 p.m., at a meeting of one of Western's student clubs and campus ministries, Christian Campus Fellowship. All who are interested in that, in hearing that talk tomorrow are welcome to attend tomorrow night's event, and it is for free. Again, thank you very much for your patience at these opening remarks. If you have not yet silenced your cell phones, please do so now. Western Washington University is privileged to have Dr. Craig on our campus. Now, as I invite Dr. Craig to come to the podium to give his talk, please join me in welcoming him, Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be here with you, and looking forward to our discussion on the next two evenings on these very important topics. And I appreciate the great weather that you rolled out for me here in Birmingham as well. I understand it's unusual. Well, the question before us this evening is, can we be good without God? Now, at first, the answer to this question might seem so obvious that even to pose it arouses indignation. For while those of us who are theists undoubtedly find in God a source of moral strength and resolve that enables us to lead lives better than those that we should live without Him, nevertheless, it would seem arrogant and ignorant to claim that those who do not share a belief in God do not often lead good moral lives. Indeed, embarrassingly, sometimes lives that put our own to shame. But wait, it would be ignorant and arrogant to claim that people cannot be good without belief in God. But that wasn't the question. The question was, can we be good without God? When we ask that question, we are posing in a provocative way the meta-ethical question of the objectivity of moral values. Are the values that we hold dear and guide our lives by mere social conventions, akin to driving on the left versus right-hand side of the road, or mere expressions of personal taste, like having a preference for vanilla as opposed to chocolate? Or are they valid independently of our apprehension of them? And if so, what is their foundation? As the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz has put it, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation. That is to say, their foundation in reality. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground are they purely ephemeral. In his book, The Courage to Become, Kurtz helpfully distinguishes three main views in answer to this question. Theism maintains that moral values are grounded in God. Humanism maintains that moral values are grounded in human beings. And nihilism maintains that moral values have no ground at all and are therefore ultimately illusory and non-binding. Now, whether God is necessary for morality depends on what we mean by morality. If by morality you mean simply a certain pattern of social behavior prevalent among human beings, then obviously that sort of behavior could go on even if it turned out that God does not exist. God isn't necessary in order for human beings to exhibit certain patterns of social behavior that we call acting morally. But if by morality you mean that certain things are really good or evil, that certain actions are unconditionally obligatory or impermissible, then many theists and non-theists alike agree that God is indeed necessary for morality. In the absence of God, morality turns out to be just a human illusion. The same patterns of social behavior might go on without God, but it would be a delusion to think that such behavior has any objective moral significance. Accordingly, I'm going to argue tonight that if God exists, then the objectivity of moral values and moral duties is secured. But in the absence of God, that is to say, if God does not exist, then morality is plausibly just a human convention. That is to say, morality is wholly subjective and non-binding. We might act in precisely the same ways that we do in fact act, but in the absence of God, such actions would no longer count as good or evil, since if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Thus, we cannot truly be good without God. On the other hand, if we do believe that moral values and duties are objective, that provides moral grounds for believing in God. Moreover, I shall raise the question, if morality is just a human illusion, then why should we act morally, especially when it conflicts with self-interest? Or are we in some way held accountable for our moral decisions and actions? I shall argue that theism provides a more coherent view of morality by providing a basis for moral accountability. Consider then the hypothesis that God exists, whereby God I mean a personal supreme being. First, if God exists, then objective moral values exist. When we talk about moral values, we're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. It's to say, for example, that Nazi anti-Semitism was morally evil even though the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust thought that it was morally good. And it would still be evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them, so that everyone thought the Holocaust was good. On the theistic view, objective moral values are rooted in God. God's own holy and perfectly good nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. God himself is what Plato called the good. He is the locus and source of moral value. He is by nature loving, generous, fair, faithful, kind, and so forth. Sometimes people ask, does God will something because it is good? Or is something good because God wills it? The question is a false dilemma. Traditional theism rejects both alternatives. The alternative, traditionally taken by theists, is that God wills something because he is good. That is to say, the good just is God himself. He is the paradigm of goodness. Therefore, the good is not independent of God. Rather, God is the good. So, if God exists, objective moral values exist. Second, if God exists, objective moral duties exist. Duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Now, you might think that the distinction between right and wrong is the same as the distinction between good and evil. But if you think about it, you can see that this isn't the case. Duty has to do with moral obligation, what I ought or ought not to do. Now, obviously, you're not morally obligated to do something just because it would be good for you to do it. For example, it would be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to become a doctor. After all, it would also be good for you to become a firefighter, or a homemaker, or a diplomat, but you can't do them all. So there's a difference between moral values and moral duties. To say that we have objective moral duties is, again, to say that we have certain moral obligations to fulfill regardless of whether we think that we do. On theism, our moral duties are constituted by God's commands. God's moral nature is expressed toward us in the form of divine commands, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, these commands are reflections of his moral nature. His commands to us are therefore not capricious, but are the expression of his character. Therefore, it makes no sense to ask, for example, if God were to command us to eat our children, would it be right to eat them? Because this proposition has an impossible antecedent clause and therefore no non-trivial truth value. It's like asking, if there were a square circle, would its area be the square of one of its sides? The question has no meaningful answer because it's logically incoherent. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, are reflections of his essential character. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the whole moral duty of man can be summed up in the two great commandments. First, you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, and with all your soul, and with all your heart, and with all your mind. And second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression. Finally, on the theistic hypothesis, God holds all persons morally accountable for their actions. Evil and wrong will be punished. Righteousness will be vindicated. good ultimately triumphs over evil, and we shall finally see that we do live in a moral universe after all. Despite the inequities of this life, in the end the scales of God's justice will be balanced. And thus the choices that we make in this life are infused with an eternal significance. We can, with consistency, make moral choices which run contrary to our self-interest, and even undertake acts of extreme self-sacrifice, knowing that such decisions are not empty and ultimately meaningless gestures. Rather, our moral lives have a paramount significance. So, I think it's evident that theism provides a sound foundation for morality. Now, contrast this with the non-theistic hypothesis. First, if God does not exist, then what is the foundation for objective moral values? More particularly, what is the basis for the objective value of human beings? If God does not exist, then it's difficult to see any reason to think that human beings are special, or that their morality is objectively true. On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, exhibit similar behavior for the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science Michael Ruse reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself noted in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation to speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias in favor of one's own species. The objectivelessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why on atheism is he wrong when he says there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference? We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur. Second, if God does not exist, objective moral duties do not exist. If God does not exist, then what source remains for objective moral duties? Traditionally, our moral duties were thought to spring from God's commandments, such as the Ten Commandments. But if there is no God, what basis remains for objective moral duties? On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it does not murder it. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it does not rape her. For there is no moral dimension to these actions. They are neither prohibited nor obligatory. So, if God does not exist, why think that we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these moral duties upon us? Where did they come from? It's very hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression ingrained into us by societal and parental conditioning. Richard Taylor, an eminent ethicist, writes as follows: "The modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. Thus, even educated persons sometimes declare that such things as war or abortion or violation of certain human rights are morally wrong. And they imagine that they have said something true and significant. Educated people do not need to be told, however, that questions such as these have never been answered outside of religion." He concludes, contemporary writers in ethics who blithely discourse upon moral right and wrong and moral obligation without any reference to religion are really just weaving intellectual webs from thin air, which amounts to saying, that they discourse without meaning. On the atheistic view, certain actions, such as incest and rape, may be biologically and socially disadvantageous. And so, in the course of human evolution, they have become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape or incest is really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. If, as Kurtz states, the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit and custom, in feeling and fashion, then the rapist who goes against the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably. The moral equivalent, if you will, of Lady Gaga. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law which we must obey. Now, it's important that we remain clear in understanding the issue before us this evening. The question is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? There's no reason to think that non-theists and theists alike may not live what we normally characterize as good and decent lives. Similarly, the question is not, can we formulate a system of ethics without reference to God? If the non-theist grants that human beings do have objective value, then there's no reason to think that he cannot work out a system of ethics with which the theist would also largely agree. Or again, the question is not, can we recognize the existence of objective moral values without reference to God? The theist will typically maintain that a person need not believe in God in order to recognize, say, that we should love our children. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? And I see no reason to think that they would. Thus, if God does not exist, it becomes impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil, nor can one praise brotherhood, equality, or love as good. It does not matter what values you choose, for there is no right and wrong. Good and evil do not exist. Now think of what that implies. That means that an atrocity like the Holocaust was really morally indifferent. You may think that it was wrong, but the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. In his book, Morality After Auschwitz, Peter Haas asks how an entire society could have willingly participated in a state-sponsored program of mass torture and genocide for over a decade without any serious opposition. He argues that far from being contemptuous of ethics, the perpetrators acted in strict conformity with an ethic which held that however difficult and unpleasant the task might have been, mass extermination of the Jews and Gypsies was entirely justified. The Holocaust, as a sustained effort, was possible only because a new ethic was in place that did not define the arrest and deportation of Jews as wrong, and in fact defined it as ethically tolerable and even good. Moreover, Haas points out, because of its coherence and internal consistency, the Nazi ethic could not be discredited from within. Only from a transcendent vantage point, which stands above relativistic socio-cultural mores, could such a critique be launched. But in the absence of God, it is precisely such a vantage point that we lack. One rabbi who was imprisoned at Auschwitz said that it was as though a world existed in which all the 10 commandments had been reversed. Thou shalt kill, thou shalt lie, thou shalt steal. Mankind has never seen such a hell. And yet, in a real sense, if atheism is true, then our world is Auschwitz. There is no good and evil, no right and wrong. Objective moral values and duties do not exist. Finally, my third point. If God does not exist, there is no moral accountability for one's actions. Even if there were objective moral values and duties under atheism, they are ultimately inconsequential because there is no moral accountability. If life ends at the grave, then it makes no difference whether one lives as a Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. The state torturers in Soviet prisons understood this all too well. Richard Wurmbrand, who was tortured for his faith in communist prisons, reports, the cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man. The communist torturers often said, there is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish. I have heard one torturer even say, I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart. He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. Given the finality of death, it really does not matter how you live. So what do you say to someone who says that we may as well just live for self-interest, live as you please? This presents a pretty grim picture for an atheistic ethicist like Kai Nielsen of the University of Calgary. He writes, we have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that all really rational persons should not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. Now, somebody might say that it's in our best self-interest to adopt a moral lifestyle. But clearly, that is not always true. We all know situations in which self-interest runs smack dab in the face of morality. Moreover, if one is sufficiently powerful, like a Ferdinand Marcos, or a Papadoc Duvalier, or even a Donald Trump, one can pretty much ignore the dictates of conscience and live safely in self-indulgence. Historian Stuart C. Easton sums it up well when he writes, there is no objective reason why man should be moral unless morality pays off in his social life or makes him feel good. There is no objective reason why man should do anything save for the pleasure it affords him. Acts of self-sacrifice become particularly imprudent on a naturalistic worldview. Why should you sacrifice your self-interest, and especially your life, for the sake of someone else. There can be no good reason for adopting such a self-negating course of action on a naturalistic worldview. Considered from the sociobiological point of view, such altruistic behavior is merely the result of evolutionary conditioning, which helps to perpetuate the species. A mother rushing into a burning house to save her children, or a soldier who gives his life to save his comrades, is like a fighter ant which sacrifices itself for the sake of the anthill. Common sense dictates that we should resist, if we can, the socio-biological pressures to such self-destructive activity and choose instead to act in our best self-interest. The philosopher of religion, John Hick, invites us to imagine an ant who is suddenly endowed with the insights of sociobiology and the freedom to make personal decisions. He writes, suppose him to be called upon to immolate himself for the sake of the anthill. He feels the powerful pressure of instinct pushing him toward this self-destruction. But he asks himself, why should he voluntarily carry out the suicidal program to which instinct prompts him? Why should he regard the future existence of a million other ants as more important to him than his own continued existence? Since all that he is and has and ever can have is his own present existence, surely, insofar as he is free from the domination of the blind force of instinct, he will opt for life, his own life. Now, why should we choose any differently? The absence of moral accountability from the philosophy of naturalism makes an ethic of compassion and self-sacrifice a hollow abstraction. R.C. Friedman, who is a philosopher at the University of Toronto, sums it up well. He says, without religion, the coherence of an ethic of compassion cannot be established. The principle of respect for persons and the principle of the survival of the fittest are mutually exclusive. We thus come to radically different perspectives on morality depending on whether or not God exists. If God exists, then there is a sound foundation for morality. If God does not exist, then it's plausible that there are no objective moral values, no objective moral duties, and no moral accountability. We are ultimately landed in nihilism. God is therefore vitally necessary to morality. Now, as I said, this is a conclusion that is accepted by a good many atheist philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Russell, and Sartre. Though the conclusion is a painful one, these thinkers believe that honesty compels them to face it squarely. The challenge facing the non-theist philosopher who continues to cling to objective moral values and duties after letting go of God is threefold. And let me see if I have this on the PowerPoint. No. Okay. Here's the threefold challenge for those who want to cling to moral values and duties objectively after letting go of God. First, they need to explain what is the basis of objective moral values on atheism. In particular, what is the basis for the intrinsic value of human beings? Second, they need to explain what is the source of moral duties on atheism. What makes certain acts objectively obligatory or forbidden if there is no moral lawgiver to command or prohibit them? And thirdly, they need to explain how on atheism ultimate moral accountability exists, or alternatively, why it is not necessary to morality. But the choice between theism and atheism need not be arbitrarily made. On the contrary, the very considerations that we have been discussing can constitute moral justification for the existence of God. And here we come to my third point. First, if we do think that objective moral values exist, then we shall be led logically to the conclusion that God exists. And could anything be more obvious than the objective reality of moral values that we experience in moral experience? There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. The reasoning of Michael Ruse, quoted earlier, is at worst a textbook example of the genetic fallacy. That is to say, trying to invalidate a position by showing how someone came to believe that position. And at best only proves that our subjective perception of objective moral values has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered, not invented, then such a gradual and fallible apprehension of the moral realm no more undermines the objective reality of that realm than our gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the objectivity of that realm. The fact is that in moral experience, we do apprehend objective moral values. Actions like rape, torture, child abuse, and brutality aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Even Michael Ruse himself admits in another context that I quote, "The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Notice that here Ruse attributes to moral truths the same logical necessity that characterizes the truths of elementary arithmetic. By the same token, love, generosity, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. People who fail to see this are just morally handicapped, and there's no reason to allow their impaired vision to call into question what we see clearly. Thus, the existence of objective moral values serves to demonstrate the existence of God." That's Ruse's statement. Secondly, consider the nature of moral obligation. In moral experience, we find certain moral obligations or prohibitions imposed upon us. Speaking recently on a Canadian university campus, I noticed a poster put up by the Sexual Assault and Information Center. It read, "Sexual assault. No one has the right to abuse a child, woman, or man." Now, most of us would recognize that statement is evidently true. But the atheist can make no sense of a person's right not to be sexually abused by another person. The best answer to the question as to the source of moral obligation is that moral rightness or wrongness consists in agreement or disagreement with the will or commands of a holy, loving God. But then it follows that if you do believe that certain acts are really right or wrong, then you should believe in God. Finally, take the problem of moral accountability. Here we find a powerful practical argument for believing in God. According to the Harvard philosopher William James, practical arguments can be used only when theoretical arguments are insufficient to decide a question of urgent and pragmatic importance. But it seems obvious that a practical argument could also be used to back up or motivate acceptance of the conclusion of a sound theoretical argument. To believe then that God does not exist and that there is thus no moral accountability would be quite literally demoralizing. For then we'd have to accept that our moral choices are ultimately insignificant, since both our fate and that of the universe will be the same, regardless of what we do. By demoralization, I mean a deterioration of moral motivation. It's hard to do the right thing, especially when that means sacrificing your own self-interest, and to resist temptation to do wrong when desire is strong, and the belief that ultimately it does not matter what you choose or do is apt to sap one's moral strength and so undermine one's moral life. As Robert Adams observes, having to regard it as very likely that the history of the universe will not be good on the whole, no matter what one does, seems apt to induce a cynical sense of futility about the moral life, undermining one's moral resolve and one's interest in moral considerations. By contrast, there is nothing so likely to strengthen the moral life as the beliefs that one will be held accountable for one's actions and that one's choices really do make a difference in bringing about the good. Theism is thus a morally advantageous belief. And this, in the absence of any theoretical argument establishing atheism to be the case, provides practical grounds to believe in God and motivation to accept the conclusions of the two theoretical arguments that I just gave. In summary, then, theological metaethical foundations do seem to be necessary for morality. If God does not exist, then it's plausible to think that there are no objective moral values, that we have no objective moral duties to fulfill, and that there is no moral accountability for how we live and act. The horror of such a morally neutral world is obvious. If, on the other hand, we hold, as it seems rational to do, that objective moral values and duties do exist, then we have good moral grounds for believing in the existence of God. In addition, we have powerful practical grounds for embracing theism in view of the morally bracing effects which belief in moral accountability produces. In conclusion, we cannot then truly be good without God. But if we can in some measure be good, then it follows logically that God exists. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Craig one more time. He's in great demand, globally speaking, so we're privileged to have him on our campus. Right now it is 8 o'clock, and we will take a 5-minute break, just enough for people to use the facilities. If anyone needs to use the restrooms, they're both in the basement. Just take the stairs down. The women's are on the right. The men's room is on the left. If there's a line also on the subsequent floors above us, you can take the stairs going up. Again, there are bathrooms on both the right and the left side of the stairs. So we will resume the Q&A in about 5 minutes. So thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you very much for coming back. We're about to begin the Q&A session. Thank you. Just as a reminder, Dr. William Craig will be speaking again tomorrow evening in this same room at 7 p.m. It is one of the weekly meetings of Campus Christian Fellowship. And again, if you're interested, you're welcome to join that. It will begin at 7 p.m. tomorrow night. Same parking if people are wondering about that, if you're coming from off campus. Okay. So we'll begin the Q&A session. The way we'll do that, we have 2 roving microphones. I will recognize you if you would just hold your hand up, keep your hand up for a moment until I direct one of the mics to you. Again, if you wish to ask a question, please do ask a question and limit it to one question at a time. Okay? Then let's begin. Okay. The gentleman in the red T-shirt in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
So, if God does not exist, then there can be no objective morals. But I was thinking, what about self-declared morals, or socially constructed morals, or the Nazis, for instance? Is it possible that morals are merely people inflicting their ideas on each other? Can you clarify this?
Yes, I said, in fact, I agreed that if by morality you just mean certain patterns of social behavior that people engage in, then obviously that sort of behavior could still go on, even if it turned out that God does not exist. So I'm talking about moral values that are valid and binding independently of whether anybody believes them or not. But obviously morality in the sense in which you've expressed it doesn't depend on God. Indeed, I think that if God doesn't exist, that's all morality is. It's just a sort of social construct.
This is a question for somebody who would ask that question. Being good is a hard thing to do, very hard. It requires us to do things we'd rather not do, like obeying our conscience. It's no fun, so why bother?
So what was the last sentence in the question?
I would ask, why bother being good? It's hard.
Oh.
What's the point?
Yes. Well, I think that 2 things could be said about that. First, you're morally obligated to do it. You should do it, because this is the right thing to do, despite the difficulty. But then if that doesn't move you, I would appeal to moral accountability. You will be held morally accountable for what you do, and that ought to give you a very good reason for adopting the moral point of view.
Hi, Dr. Craig. Thanks so much for speaking with us tonight. My question doesn't necessarily have to do with doing good, but I'm just going to throw it out there to you anyways. That's okay? Hopefully that's okay with everybody else. So I live with 2 atheists. One was actually going into ministry for a while. They're both, one's in his 50s, one's in his 70s. And we have a lot of discussions on beliefs and our belief systems and their non-belief systems. And the question that they always pose to me about my faith in Christianity is, if there were so many stories before that lined up with the same story of Jesus, as in a virgin birth and dying and coming back to life, that were supposedly told before, why do I believe that the one of Jesus is the true story?
Okay. There are 2 levels on which one can respond to that question. The first one is that, in fact, there are not these supposed parallels or previous such stories. This was explored by scholars in comparative religion in the late 19th, early 20th century. Scholars in comparative religion ransacked the literature of ancient mythology looking for parallels to Christian beliefs. And some even suggested that Christian beliefs might be due to the influence of these pagan myths. This movement, however, soon collapsed within scholarship. principally for two reasons. First of all, as I say, it turned out that the parallels were spurious. For example, take the supposed parallels to a virgin birth. When you look at these pagan mythological stories, what they actually are stories of a god coming down from heaven, assuming human form or animal form, and having sexual intercourse with human females. And so it's the exact opposite of a virgin birth. It's not a virginal conception at all. It's a story of gods copulating with women. In fact, the virgin birth story in the Gospels is unparalleled in either pagan mythology or Jewish literature prior to the time of Jesus. Similarly, with regard to so-called dying and rising deities, it's generally agreed among scholars in comparative religions today that there are no myths of dying and rising deities in the ancient world. Mythological figures like Osiris don't come back to life. He just lives on in the underworld and continues to reign in the realm of the dead. So this claim that early Christian belief should be understood due to the influence of or against the backdrop of pagan mythology is a view that is 100 years out of date under scholars. It has been abandoned since the beginning of the early years of the 20th century. And the fact that this is still propagated on the internet and in certain infidel websites is simply testimony to the enormous gap that exists between scholarly work on these subjects and popular culture. In fact, scholars have come to realize that the proper context for understanding the Gospels and Jesus of Nazareth is not pagan mythology, but first century Palestinian Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew, and all the disciples were Jews. And it is against the backdrop of first century Palestinian Judaism that Jesus and the Gospels are to be properly understood. So that this earlier idea of interpreting them against the backdrop of pagan mythology has just been completely abandoned among historical scholars today. It was realized that this was the wrong interpretive context for understanding Jesus of Nazareth. That would be the first reason. The second the second reason is that when you do investigate the Gospels with a view toward establishing their historical credibility, then it turns out that they are very good sources for the life of Jesus historically. So that they're not myths. These are not fairy tales or legends. These are of the genre of ancient biography, like the lives of famous Greeks and Romans, such as Plutarch wrote. And ancient biographies have a historical interest. So what they amount to are 4 biographies of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, as well as then the other materials in the New Testament, so that contemporary historical Jesus scholars treat the Gospels and the New Testament documents seriously as important sources for the life of Jesus, and have largely confirmed the outline of the portrait of Jesus painted in the Gospels. So it's just incorrect to equate these with myths. They're not. They're biography. They're history.
My question assumes that this God reveals or conveys his moral laws through some natural means in the universe. Is this conveyance or revelation, is it static or is it dynamic based on the individual level of receptibility?
Well, as a Christian theist, I would say it is dynamic in that certain of the laws that God, for example, commanded ancient Israel to observe are no longer valid today. So I think that the laws that were appropriate for Israel at that time in its infancy didn't necessarily express the full moral will of God, but in some cases represented condescensions to the situation in which Israel existed and were satisfactory, but didn't express his full will. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, you see, for example, Jesus sharpening the law and the ethic of the Old Testament and seeing its inner point and reinforcing that in contrast to the simple external legalistic interpretation of that. So I do think it can be dynamic, but underlying that, there will be certain timeless ethical principles, like the intrinsic value of human beings, and that we should treat others as ends in themselves rather than as means to ends. But how that comes to expression in various societies and times may vary.
Mr. Craig, thank you for coming and speaking with us. I want to ask you a slightly unrelated question as well. I wanted to ask you, what is the most thought-provoking or challenging question or statement ever posed to you in one of your debates with Christopher Hitchens?
In one of my debates, did you say?
Yes.
Well,
discussion.
Let me answer a somewhat different question. I would say that the most provocative and challenging question that has been posed to me didn't come in a debate, but rather in the context of a philosophy conference that I was participating in. And what this philosopher pointed out was that many of us philosophers assume that there are certain abstract entities like propositions, properties, mathematical objects like numbers and sets. And what he pointed out is that these are really incompatible with the existence of God, because on the Judeo-Christian view, God is the creator of everything outside of himself. God is like the peak of the pyramid of being. And apart from himself, all other being depends on God for its existence. But these Platonic entities like numbers and sets and propositions, which many of us had just unquestioningly assumed exist, if they exist, would seem to be uncreated objects, necessarily existing objects, and therefore present a tremendous objection to theism. Now, that may not be something that has disturbed you at night, but when I first heard this, it was like a knife in the heart, because I had just assumed that there were such things. And yet, if they exist, it would seem to be incompatible with theism. So this was a great, great challenge. And I simply put it on the back burner for many years. But about a decade or so ago, I picked it up and began to work on it. And this has been my major research focus now for over 10 years. And I'm currently in the process of completing a book on this subject where I try to meet this challenge. And so this is a question I've been very exercised about and very interested in.
So this question is sort of like his question, except I'm not assuming there's a God, but I think you talked about discovering morals like we discovered physical laws. So I'm wondering, I think it's plausible that there could be naturalistic moral laws like there are naturalistic, possibly physical laws. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how objective morality necessarily leads to a God, specifically the Christian God.
Well, it doesn't lead to a Christian God. There's nothing that I've said here tonight that wouldn't be agreed to by a Muslim or a Jew. I've simply argued for a kind of theism, but not for Christian theism. And I can't see how, on naturalism, for the reasons I gave, you're going to be able to generate things like moral obligations and prohibitions. How, on naturalism, could there be a prohibition to engage in a certain act? I mean, there's no one to forbid it. Or how could you have an obligation to do something on naturalism when there's no one to command it? So the idea that there could be moral obligation and prohibition on naturalism, which is the view that just the physical world is all there is, to me is just unintelligible. And similarly, with regard to values, I don't see why Homo sapiens on naturalism would be intrinsically valuable, especially if you're a materialist and a determinist. It would seem to me that these are just relatively advanced primates, and that morality is just an illusion, that evolution and social conditioning is built into them. So I'm simply repeating, in a sense, what I said in my talk, but that would be the answer to the question that you asked. Hello.
Hey. Okay, so thanks for being here, Dr. Craig. I've been pretty excited all week about this. So according to your definition of God, a maximally supreme relational being, and the answer to the Euthyphro objection that you gave,
Yes.
Then it seems to me that God has to essentially be perfectly good, or morally good. If that is so, then it seems that it is irrational to thank God for the good things he does, because he couldn't have done otherwise. Us Christian folk do, in fact, thank God pretty regularly for the good things he does. It's actually commanded to us in the Bible to do so. However, if God couldn't have done otherwise, it is irrational, or God is not relational, or God isn't essentially perfectly good. So, thank you.
All right, very good question. I do not think that, in fact, we should praise God for doing his moral duties. I don't think that God has any moral duties. If moral duties flow or are constituted by God's commands, then since God doesn't issue commands to himself to do things, it would follow that God has no moral duties, and therefore has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, he shouldn't be praised for fulfilling his moral obligations, since he has none. Rather, we can exploit here a distinction made by the philosopher Immanuel Kant between acting from duty and acting in accordance with duty. And I would say that when we act from duty or out of a duty, we are acting in ways which God may act in simply naturally. He doesn't act from duty or from obligation, but he acts in line with what would be a moral obligation, say, for us, to be loving, to be kind, to be generous, and so forth. These are simply the natural outflow of his moral nature. So we shouldn't praise God for fulfilling his moral obligations. So what then should we do? Well, I think the answer is adoration. We should adore God for being supremely good, because he is the paradigm of goodness, infinite goodness and value, and therefore is ultimately adorable in the literal sense, not in the sense of being cute, but in the theological sense that one would adore him with unconditional love and abandonment. So that would be the way I would understand how we ought to, as believers, relate to God, as offering him adoration for who he is, rather than praise for doing his moral duty. Now, in many cases, God can do things for which we can thank him, because he didn't have to do them. For example, you're right, God couldn't do evil, but that doesn't mean that he, say, had to give me my beautiful wife. He could have given some other woman as wife to me, and that would have been a good gift as well. But given the person that I got, I can be grateful to God and thank him for this gift. You see what I mean? I know a good person can give different gifts. And so it's perfectly appropriate to thank that good person for that particular gift that you've received. And so in that sense, I think it's wholly appropriate to say, God, thank you for that job, or thank you for leading me to have this friend, or for giving me success in this venture, or something of that sort. Because he could be good and yet not have to do those things.
Dr. Craig, my question is personal in nature. Can you share with us the circumstances, details around in your own life how you came to faith in Jesus Christ as Lord?
How I came to faith?
Yeah.
Yes, I'd
was
be
that like for
happy
you?
to share that. I wasn't raised in a Christian family or even a church-going home, though it was a good and loving home. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And in the search for answers, I began to attend, all on my own initiative, a church in our local community to try to find these answers. The only problem was, instead of answers, all I found was a sort of social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate. And the other high school students who claimed to be such good Christians on Sunday lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And this really bothered me because I thought, here I feel so spiritually empty inside, and yet externally, at least, I'm leading a better life than these people are, and they claim to be Christians. They're just all a pack of hypocrites. They're all phonies. They're pretending to be something they're not. And so I began to become very angry and embittered toward the local church and the people in it for the hypocrisy that I saw. And soon this attitude began to spread toward other people. As I looked at others, I thought they're all phonies. Everybody is holding up a plastic mask to the world, and the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I hated them for their phoniness and lack of authenticity. And I said, I don't need other people. I don't want anything to do with them. I hate people. And I threw myself into my studies and shunned relationships with others. I was on my way, frankly, toward becoming a very alienated young man. But at the same time, in moments of honesty and introspection, when I looked into my own heart, I realized that deep down, I really did want to love and to be loved by others. And I realized in that moment that I was just as much a phony as they were. Because here I was putting on this big front, pretending not to need other people, when deep down inside I knew I really did. And so that anger that I felt turned in upon myself for my own hypocrisy and phoniness. And I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just eats away at your insides day after day, making every day miserable, another day to get through. And I remember one day I was feeling particularly crummy, and I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind a girl who is one of these types, you know, that is always so happy, it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said to her, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, it's because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd never heard this before. And the idea that there was someone who really loved me, and who was it but the God of the universe, just staggered me. I couldn't take it in. Well, I went home that night, and I found a New Testament that had been given to me by the Gideons when I was in the 6th grade, when they came to our grade school. I'd never read it, but I picked it up, and I began to read it. And as I did so, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about this man's teaching that I had never encountered before. And there was an authenticity about his life that was not characteristic of those people who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending. And I realized then that I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And as I read the New Testament, it became clear to me what my own problem was. My own wrongdoing and evil had separated me from God, so that the relationship that I was created to have with God was ruptured. And as a result, God seemed so unreal and distant to me. But the New Testament said that God had sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to pay the penalty for my sin and restore the relationship with God that I was created to have. Well, Sandy introduced me to other Christian students in the high school. I'd never met people like this. No matter what they said about Jesus, the thing that I couldn't deny was that they were in contact with a plane of reality that I didn't even dream existed. A reality that gave a deep meaning and joy to their lives that I craved. Well, to make a long story short, after about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I've ever gone through in my life, I just came to the end of my rope. And one night I cried out to God. And I cried out all the bitterness and the anger that had been building up inside of me. And as I did so, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I rushed outside. It was a warm Midwestern September evening. And as I looked up at the sky, I could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And as I looked at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my whole life, because I had thought enough about this during those 6 months to realize that if this were really the truth, if it were really the truth, then I could do nothing less than give my entire life to sharing this message among mankind, because this is the greatest news ever announced. And so basically that's so basically that's why I'm here at Western Washington, because I love to share this message with students who are around the same age that I was when my life was turned so radically upside down. Oh, thanks.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Craig. It's kind of surreal to see someone that's the subject of my many YouTube searches in person. So, you indicate that good actions are inherently good because they are derived from God, who in turn you have stated is inherently good. I'm wondering what your justification is for him or her being good. It seems that if there is a derivative for our good actions, God, then there must also be a derivative for his goodness. However, if this were so, we would be led into an infinite digress for the source of good.
Exactly. And so there would be no good, would there, if there were an infinite regress? And so it has to stop somewhere. You have to get back to an ultimate reality which just is goodness itself. An example or an illustration would be when we say a recording is high fidelity. What do we mean by that? We say that in comparison to the sound of a live orchestra, this recording approaches a certain approximation to that standard. But when you get to the sound of the live orchestra itself, it's not high fidelity to anything else. It is that against which something is determined to have high fidelity. Now, why stop with God? Well, I think a couple of reasons can be offered. First, by definition, God is a being who is worthy of worship. If there were any other thing that existed that was not worthy of worship, it wouldn't be God. In order to be God, it is necessary to be worthy of worship. And to be worthy of worship is to be absolute goodness. Otherwise, you could admire it. Something could be worthy of admiration, but not of worship, not of adoration, what we were talking about before. So that God, being by definition worthy of worship, is a very appropriate stopping point for this moral standard. The second reason is, as St. Anselm pointed out, God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being. If you could conceive of something greater than God, then that would be God. So by the very concept God, we're talking about the greatest conceivable being. And it is greater to be goodness itself, to be the standard of goodness, than to merely live up to some other external standard. So by the concept of God as a maximally great being, or the greatest conceivable being, this would require that God, I think, be the good. So for both of those reasons, I think that a moral theory which finds or locates the good in God is a very plausible moral theory.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. This relates to an earlier question, but I want to push it a little bit further. I'm not convinced by your claim that if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Could there not be a source of objective moral goodness apart from God? What about the naturalistic moral realism of Peter Railton and Philippa Foot, or non-naturalists like G.E. Moore? You seem to dismiss these views too quickly.
Well, I would say that these other non-theistic views all seem to begin with the assumption that human beings have intrinsic moral worth. And if you begin with that assumption, then of course I think you can develop an ethical system with which, as I said, the theists will largely agree. But I've never seen any of these theorists who address the question why, on atheism, think that human beings do have intrinsic moral value. That seems to be the starting point and assumption of these views, and it seems to me that they're explanatorily deficient in that regard. There just isn't any explanation on those views as to why we ought to think that this species on this planet is the locus of moral goodness. And this kind of relates to the question that was posed here. Why think that human beings are an appropriate stopping point in this regress of questions? Why is something good? I think when you get to God, you hit the metaphysical ultimate. It's an appropriate stopping point, but with regard to human beings, it's just far from obvious that that's an appropriate stopping point for saying this is where the question, why is this good, comes to an end. Which would basically be my critique of humanism. Remember, Kurtz differentiated between theism, humanism, and nihilism. It seems to me that humanism just is a sort of faith commitment to the intrinsic value of human beings in an atheistic universe. And I don't see any reason to think that that faith commitment is true. It seems to me that to say human beings are the stopping point is premature and arbitrary.
Okay. First of all, I was super excited that you were coming. I've been talking about it, I think, since I found out. So thank you. But okay, if it's logically impossible for God to command us to do something bad, such as eating our children, as you stated, then does this create a problem for the theistic view of God's omnipotence, in that he wouldn't be able to command that?
This is a good question, but I think that apart from Descartes, René Descartes, mainstream Christian theologians have never thought that omnipotence means the ability to do the logically impossible, to make a square circle or a married bachelor. Those aren't really things at all. Those are just combinations of words, but there isn't anything there that God is incapable of doing. And similarly, to act contrary to his own nature would be to do the logically impossible. So it's not a thing, really, that falls outside the scope of God's omnipotence. God's omnipotence is the ability to actualize any sort of logically possible state of affairs. And that wouldn't be a state of affairs that's logically possible.
Testing. Dr. Craig, I have a question that follows on that. So, based on the example, you said it would be logically impossible for God to command us to eat our own children. And you used the analogy to like a square circle. But whereas a square circle is logically impossible, it's not logically impossible, it seems to me, for a God to command someone to eat their own children. I mean, I think that asks the question, and it actually presumes the nature of the God that we're trying to see if he or she exists. So could you follow up on that?
Yes, what I'm talking about is not some sort of exceptional case. I'm talking about as a general moral principle. And I do think that that's logically impossible because it would be incompatible with the goodness of God, with his compassion, kindness, and so forth, for that to be a sort of general moral principle. So I take it that that is a logical impossibility.
Thank you. So I have a question concerning the inherent validity of your logical argument, can we be good without God? As you know, as a logician, the inherent truth value of a statement is due to the validity of the conditionals, and you're I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Sorry, I did write it down. Given the implied truth of the conditionals, however, as a logician, you should know that truth value is not created through the validity of the conditional. Valid arguments can have completely incorrect or untrue conclusions. Your logic clearly concludes that there is a certain logical reason and need for God in the presence of morality. However, it does this while relying on the implied truth factor that due to the notion or existence of God, supported by really no other claim other than God has presence in our world. This does not address the nature of the God as you seem to have identified with him as Jesus of Nazareth.
No, I admitted that. I said
I
in
know.
response to the question over
I'm just asking how. I'm sorry. Yeah. Quite embarrassing. I have public speaking.
Well, let me respond to the question that's been asked already, because I think he's already made a good point. And that is that he points out that simply having a valid argument doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. You can have valid arguments that imply false conclusions if the premises are false. And therefore, for an argument to be a sound argument, it needs to be both logically valid and have true premises. Now, in the argument that I've offered, the logic is impeccable. It's the logical rule of inference called modus tollens, where you have P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. The logical inference is impeccable. Therefore, the only question is the truth of the premises. And there are two premises. Premise one was, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two is, but objective moral values and duties do exist. So if you want to say the conclusion is false, you've got to say that at least one of those premises is false. But which one? It seems to me that both of them are true, that both of those are plausibly true premises, and therefore this does give good moral grounds for believing in God.
I apologize. I was a bit tongue-tied. What I wanted to end with that is that I feel as if your logic clearly indicates the possibility and valid nature of the need of God in the human notion of morality. I do not understand how this translates into an interpretation as a divine being as defined in any religion. I just see it as a human construction. And
well, again, I haven't tried to argue for any specific religion tonight. I am a Christian, obviously, and when students have posed questions to me about my Christian belief, I'm forthright. But there was nothing in that lecture whatsoever that mentioned the Christian God. This is a lecture that any deist or Muslim or Jew would be happy to resonate with. It simply says that if there isn't any God, whom I defined as a personal supreme being, then moral values and duties are not objective. But it's plausible that moral values and duties are objective, and from that it follows that God exists. Now, what kind of a God this is, who he is, has he revealed himself in some way more fully that we can know about him, that's a question for another talk.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, for holding this discussion. My question is about God himself.
All right.
There have been many different types of gods throughout history, and many continue to exist. Since God defines the framework of what is good, do you feel it is reasonable that we support only certain culturally accepted gods? And if so, how do those with religious uncertainty go about deciding which faith to pursue?
Well, I think this is a very vital question, because otherwise one could be misled into worshiping and serving a God who doesn't actually exist. And insofar as what I've shared tonight is sound, it would mean that God would have to be a being that is in accord with our notions of moral goodness and is not evil. So I think this would disqualify certain religions of the world. For example, Islam. I think that the concept of God in Islam is morally defective. Islam was one of my side areas of study at Munich. And in the Muslim concept of God, God's omnipotence trumps even his own nature, even his own character. God can do anything. He could, on Judgment Day, according to Islam, say to all the faithful Muslims, "Ah, I tricked you. You're all going to hell, and I'm going to send the Christians and the atheists to heaven." And nothing could be said against that. It's the will of Allah. This is, I think, a concept of God which is morally defective, because it turns God into a sort of capricious, arbitrary being whose omnipotence trumps his own character even. So that would be an example of where I think, by using these sort of moral considerations, we would say that this particular purported revelation of God is in fact not correct. It is distorted. It's right insofar as it believes there is a God who exists, and he is the source of moral obligation and so forth. But when it begins to flesh this out more fully, I think then you begin to see defects in the theology.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming out. My question, beyond moral objectivity and everything like that, when I meet a person, I tend to decide to treat them in a way that does not adversely affect them psychologically, emotionally, physically. My question is, what does that have to do with God? What does that have to do with morality? And just elaborate on that.
I'm not sure what it has to do with morality, except perhaps insofar as your attitude may be an expression of your desire to treat that other person in a good way, that you want to treat that person in a loving way. You want to treat that person as an end in himself. Is that what's motivating you why you do this?
Well, I'm just saying, as a person, I feel like that's the way you should treat people.
Okay, there. See, look, that's a moral statement. That's the way you should treat people. You see, you made a statement there about what is right to do, about one's moral duty. And so what I'm saying is, why is that the way one should treat people? What's the source of that obligation? Who put that obligation on you? And what I'm suggesting is that you can ground that obligation objectively in God.
Okay, thank you.
So earlier, you said that for God to... right over here.
Oh, okay.
Great.
I'm looking out into space.
For God to command one to eat one's children would be logically inconsistent. But what about in 2 Kings when Elijah is going up the hill and 42 children come out and they laugh at him and they say, "Go on up, you bald head."
Yeah.
And then God commands 2, quote, she-bears to tear apart 42 children?
Yeah.
How is that not logically inconsistent?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. There are these odd stories that one encounters in the Old Testament that leave you scratching your head. The most I could say is that God has the ability to give and take human life as he sees fit. He is the author and giver of life, and he is under no obligation to prolong my existence for 1 second further. If he wants to strike me dead, now that's his prerogative. So if, out of his desire to vindicate his prophet, he decides to take the lives of these children, I think that's his prerogative. But beyond that, I don't know. It's a bizarre story. It's, I think, the sort of exception that proves the rule, because it's so different from what you normally have in the Hebrew God, who is patient and long-suffering and so forth. And so that makes me think that perhaps there were additional factors or details there that we don't know about. But I think that insofar as God is the author and giver of life, that he has that prerogative and that we can't gainsay it.
All right. How can Judeo-Christian scripture or any other scripture act as the ultimate moral guide to humanity when it does not explicitly condemn slavery and the institutionalized oppression of women or any number of other sadistic or amoral acts in the Bible as moral wrongs?
Right. That is a very pressing question for those who believe in biblical inerrancy. Obviously, nothing I've said tonight depends upon that. I think that a theistic grounding for ethics is necessary, regardless of whether you believe in biblical inerrancy or not. But with respect to the Bible, at least, I think that Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster?, has gone a long way toward resolving some of those difficulties. For example, I thought Copan's 2 chapters on slavery in the Old Testament were absolutely brilliant and really opened my eyes to understanding this. What we in the United States think of when we hear the word slave is we think of the institution that existed in the American South prior to the Civil War. And that is so utterly, utterly different from what the Old Testament is talking about, which was a kind of indentured servitude. A person could voluntarily enter into this slavery or indentured servanthood in order to avoid having his family torn apart because of his inability to pay his debts. This would enable him to keep his family together, to feed his children, and to eventually pay off his debts so that he would be able to then be free and be once again a free person. So that this, what is called slavery in the Old Testament isn't really slavery at all. It's actually a sort of anti-poverty program. They didn't have institutional governments with welfare and unemployment insurance and relief to families in ancient Israel. Instead, what they had was this system whereby a person who was unable to pay his debts, who was in trouble, could sell himself into a kind of indentured servant relationship and then work off those debts. And honestly, I mean, in some ways, this is actually superior to the sort of government welfare programs that we have today, which tends to tends to destroy the nuclear family. I mean, look at what aid to families with dependent children has done to the black family in the United States. It has had a terrible effect upon splitting families and leading to children born out of wedlock and raised in single-parent homes. It's engendered a culture of dependency and multi-generational poverty. So in some ways, the idea in ancient Israel of working your debts off and thereby keeping your self-respect and feeding your family, keeping them together, I mean, in some ways, this is actually better than what we do today. So I think it's, when you look at it in that light, it is just completely a complete misrepresentation to say that the Old Testament sanctioned slavery, if by that you mean what went on in the United States prior to the Civil War. So I would recommend looking at Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? I think it is an excellent treatment of some of these questions.
Why should we pray if God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent? He knows everything about us and all we need. Then why should we ask if he will do as he wishes to do in the end?
All right. I think that the answer is because he wants us to ask. He commands us to pray and to make our requests known to him. And in this way, it helps to foster a relationship with him. God wants us to have a relationship with him. And so rather than just allow us to live independent lives, he wants us to come to him in prayer and make our requests known. And of course, he knows what you're going to pray. And by knowing that, he can build into the history of the world answers to those requests because he knows what the requests will be. And were you not to pray, then it's entirely conceivable that he would not answer in that way or build those answers in. So I think our prayers really make a difference in the course of the world because God will determine how he acts in many cases based upon what we pray for.
Yeah, I want to thank you for coming tonight, Dr. Craig.
Sure.
My question is any finite amount of sin deserving of eternal punishment?
Now, would you say it again? What's the question?
Is any finite amount of sin deserving of eternal punishment? And if not, is hell then escapable?
Yes. This is a very, again, good question. His question is any sin deserving of eternal punishment? It would seem that the biblical doctrine of hell would be an example of the punishment not fitting the crime. Even horrible sins like these mass shootings at Newton or terrorism or war crimes, even horrible sins, you would think deserve only a finite amount of punishment so that after several trillion years, say, God would let them out of hell. And so given the eternality of the punishment, it seems to not fit the crime, is the objection. Now, I can think of two possible responses to this. I don't know which one is, if either is right, but I think either one is possible. The first one would be to agree, yes, every sin has only a finite punishment. But it doesn't follow from that because every sin you commit has a finite punishment, that all the sins you commit have a finite amount of punishment. If a person committed an infinite number of sins, then that would add up to an infinite punishment. Now, obviously, no one manages to commit an infinite number of sins in this life. But what about in the afterlife? Insofar as the inhabitants of hell continue to hate God and reject him, they continue to sin, and so accrue to themselves more punishment. So in a sense, hell is literally self-perpetuating, because the sinning goes on forever, the punishment goes on forever. And it seems to me that that is a perfectly plausible answer to this question. The other response that I also find plausible would be to challenge the assumption that there is no sin that deserves infinite punishment. Now, certainly, the typical sins we think about would seem to only deserve a finite punishment. But what about the sin of rejecting God himself? It seems to me that this is a sin of infinite gravity and proportion, because it is the creature raising his heel against the Creator and rejecting the Creator. And that punishment, or that sin, I think, is of infinite gravity and proportion, and plausibly deserves an infinite punishment. So if that's right, a person doesn't go to hell so much for sins of adultery and lying and murder and theft. The reason he goes to hell is because he irrevocably rejects God out of his life and separates himself from God forever. So in that sense, he actually sends himself to hell by committing this sin of infinite gravity and proportion, which is the rejection of God himself. So either of those two answers, I think, would be a plausible response to that question.
Great. We've come to the end of... Go ahead. Let's give a warm thank you to Dr. Logan Lane Craig. We've come to the end of our Q&A. Again, just a reminder, tomorrow night, Dr. Craig will be speaking in the same place, same time, 7 p.m. at the CCF weekly meeting on Friday. Thank you again very much, Dr. Craig, for coming and answering questions. Hopefully, we'll see some of you tomorrow. Thank you very much for coming.